Welcome, everybody. It's a great day here in LA. I think I need to cut it.
Okay.
Um, Thank you for coming out and joining us for this book launch. The pandemic has really done a juicy stuff for us. So we haven't had this type of a in-person meeting for a while. So, and now we're doing a hybrid version of our book launch, whereas before it's all been in person. And so there's all these technicalities that we have to deal with. In any case, it's a learning process, and I think this is a great technology that we will make use so that we can have people join from far and far and wide, even around the globe. But again, welcome. I'd like to give the mic over to Marla Maldonado, who's the president of Friends of Ecopart Fibers, president of the board, to say a few words and welcome.
Welcome, mabuhay, magandang hapon, good afternoon, everyone. So, there's a little bit of story about me being president. It wasn't hard to get me. I said yes right away because I lived in Chicago for 10 years. I came here in 2006. And my only guide were the books of our ancestors. I mean, it's like literally I stood on the shoulders of the ones who came before me. Carlos Bolosas, Philip Vera Cruz, Larry Dion. And so when I came to California, there was a opportunity to be employed here. I was so excited. And now I'm very close to the books, to the histories, the people, and more books, more authors, and Albert, and of course, Dr. Campo. So, yeah, welcome to all of you, and I'd like to introduce the ones who are with me, collaborating with us in the board. That would be Jasmine Diaga, yes, and
They're on their way.
Jaime is in the board.
Hi.
And then David Roquello,
Yeah.
and Belinda Roquello, and Camila Villaga.
He tested positive for corona, so he's sheltering at home.
Oh. Okay, so I think.
She just got on board, Vicky Perez.
Oh, Vicky Perez, sorry. Vicky, I looked at the Facebook, the Google site. Yeah, we have to update it. But anyway, thank you so much. It's nice to see familiar faces, new faces. I think we all have a history. Each one of us should write a book. Maraming salamat. Thank you so much. And I think, yeah, we should officially open this.
Thank you. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our special guest, Albert Samaha, who's written the book Concepcion, and that's the book we are launching today. How we got Albert to speak here was his publisher, Riverbend Books, is the person that's coordinating it from the publisher is Lori Ann Plata, who happens to be the sister of Godfrey Plata. And through Godfrey, I know Godfrey, we know Godfrey through Pilot. And of course, when I contacted Lori Ann, I said we'd love to first meet and greet with Albert. And we did that in October. And at that point, we offered that we would like to do the book launch. And thus we're here. So Albert has written two, the other book is I'll have Albert mention it. He has a long credits to his name. He is an investigative journalist with BuzzFeed. And I assume because he's a journalist, he does lots of reading and research. And what I love about Concepcion is I learned a lot about pre-Hispanic Philippine history. So, and of course, how he talks about his family in the US and interweaves things that are going on in the Philippines. So I'm going to ask all the speakers to also further add to their background and credits. So I will do the introduction, but without further ado, Albert.
Okay. Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting us. This is such a beautiful setting. I couldn't imagine a better place to be so close to historic Filipino town. Merla, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for organizing all this for both of y'all. I think what you said about standing on the shoulders of others is so meaningful to me, particularly today, for Anthony, of all people, to be moderating this, because Anthony's first book, Latinos of Asia, was one of the most influential books in my own sort of intellectual understanding of what it means to be Filipino American, and how we connect with other formerly colonized cultures, and sort of what makes us distinct within the Asian continent. So it means a lot to have everybody here. Thank you for taking the time out of your Saturdays. And Anthony, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, of course. Yes, of course, of course. Okay, so I'm just gonna hold this. Is that okay? Okay, so it's an honor to be here at the Carlos Bulasan Book Club. I just want to say thank you to Albert, thank you to the board, Jaime for reaching out, for including me. I feel this is kind of a moment because my entree into becoming a, can I say it, like becoming a writer, so weird. Becoming a Filipino American writer was because of a professor I had when I was in my freshman year of college by the name of Dr. Don Mabala, who passed away a couple years ago. And I feel like it was through Don's class that I started to want to tell Filipino stories, because I felt like I lived in a country and went to schools where I never belonged, and books were my way to feel like my story, my family's story had something to contribute and belonged. But a little tidbit about Don. Don's grandfather owned a diner in Stockton, California, where Carlos Bulasan used to frequent. And so I feel like Carlos Bulasan used to go to Don's Lolo's diner, and then through him is how she became inspired to become a professor. And it was her class that inspired me to be a writer. So it's very cool to have this direct lineage from Bulasan himself, and we're all here today. So I just wanted to make sure to note that. But I love this book. I feel like this book should have been the book I should have been able to read as a kid in junior high. I feel like my life would have been different had I had this book as like a 10, 11, or 12-year-old kid, and definitely different if I had it in high school and college. And the reason is that it's one book, but it honestly is 3 books in one. I feel like it's a historical book because, like Jaime said, I didn't know any of this stuff about pre-colonial Philippines until I read it. And it's a story about family, and it's a story about Albert. Everything from being a 90s Filipino American kid in Vallejo to being a football player in college, which, like, go sports, right? So and so I think without giving any spoilers away, my favorite thing to do is to talk to writers about how they even decided to write a book. So I'm like curious, two-part question. How did you even decide to become a writer? Because there's not a lot of us out there to look up to, and you can't be like, oh, I want to be like that person, right? So how did you first want to become a writer? How did you first want to start writing this book? And when did you decide that this book couldn't exist, had to have your story, your family story, and the Philippines story, because it's like I could teach an entire semester long class just on this book. So create like those are my first questions. I want
Yeah.
to start with.
I mean, I got into writing through sports. It was kind of my love for sports. I would read the San Francisco Chronicle every morning growing up in like second, third grade, read Sports Illustrated growing up. And for a while, I wanted to be a sports writer. And it wasn't until college when I started to really explore social justice things. But I think you're right. You know, this idea of not having a lot of Filipino representation, that actually really impacted my career trajectory because I would go to these, you know, newsrooms for all my jobs where the majority of my colleagues and my editors were white, and the neighborhoods and communities I covered were black. And I sort of just felt like this sort of outsider in both communities. And I had sort of always wondered what it was that I should be writing about, that I should be covering, right? Because I think anytime, you know, anyone who's a journalist, there is always something fraught about going into someone else's community and telling their stories. And my first book, Never Ran, Never Will, is about a community in Brownsville, Brooklyn, predominantly Black and Puerto Rican. And I kind of followed families there for 5 years and told those stories. And it was an amazing process, and I'm very proud of that book. But at the end of the process, I sort of did feel a little bit of this not guilt, not quite discomfort, but curiosity of, you know, what would it mean to cover a community that was my own? And what responsibilities do I have as maybe one of the few, you know, Filipino American writers out there to write about the Filipino American community? But that's not really how I came, I think, to writing this book. It sort of happened organically. I was in the Bay Area visiting with family. My first book was about to come out, and I was just thinking what my next projects would be. And I was around the same age my mom was when she came to the US from the Philippines, and her generation of titos and titas when they came, and they were still struggling. You know, my mom had this, you know, big real estate career in the early 2000s, and then the financial crash happened, and she hadn't been able to get back on her feet since, like millions of other people. My uncle Spanky was a rock star in the Philippines in VSP and Company, for those that know the band, and is now a baggage handler in San Francisco at the airport. And so many, I heard so many stories growing up about the prestige the Concepcion family had in the Philippines. My granduncle Tomas was a congressperson who was allies with the Aquinos and helped lead the revolution, and was a famous artist. My grand auntie Caridad was a spy for the Revolutionary forces and a lieutenant in the underground resistance during World War II. My grandfather Manuel and my grandmother Rosalina were kind of part of the sort of anti-Marcos opposition, and saw their own financial circumstances damaged by the dictatorship. So I would hear all these stories about our standing in the Philippines, the big house we had with maids, drivers, nannies, all this. And then I saw where we were in America. And we were, you know, we weren't struggling as much as a lot of other people, but we were certainly not at the same standing that we have in the Philippines. And I think as I reached the age where they made that decision to leave the Philippines and come to America, I couldn't help but wonder, was that the right decision? You know, would I have made the same decision in that position? And that triggered in my mind not the idea to write a book, but just at Christmas parties to ask them, you know, why did you come here? You know, just out of pure curiosity. And from those conversations, it quickly occurred to me that this was what I wanted to write about, and that there were so many stories I wanted to tell. And I think one of the damaging, lasting impacts of colonialism is that the colonizers write the stories and erase the old stories. And I sort of felt, not an obligation, I felt an excitement for putting on record stories that our descendants can read and know about what it was like at this very particular inflection point in American history, right? 1965, racist immigration laws get torn down, and they open the gates of America to people from outside of Europe. So we are sort of part of this generation. People, you know, people like me who are children of immigrants, who are sort of the first generation to grow up in the shadow of the wave of post-1965, right? So while the immigrant generation has this optimism of being able to compare the luxuries of America against the constricting forces of a dictatorship in the Philippines, I had no other country to compare it to. All I saw was Vallejo, the America around me. And that was sort of the tension I wanted to explore between sort of the America I understood from the one that my elders understood.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I love that very personal, like, entree into the book, and I love that you said, like, it all started from just having Christmas holiday conversations with folks, and then it just sort of took a life of its own. And I feel like that's real, right? Because it's not like it feels like that. And I think what I loved, for those of you who haven't read it, if you read this book, it feels like the voice is, you're talking to a homie from the 90s. Like this is like, I've never seen Filipino American, like that Filipino American voice of the 90s come through so well in a book. And there's no book that's done it as well as this. So I'm curious about, given that like editors and the publishing world is super white, how did you make the choice to want to talk like yourself? And then with that, you have a lot of Tagalog in there. And how did you make the choice to like write these Tagalog words and then not translate them? You just sort of left them. I hope you could tell folks about that, because I feel like as Filipinos, we're constantly trying to explain who we are, and you were like, fuck that, I'm not gonna do that. So
a lot of people think, a lot of influence, thanks for that. Ironically enough, it was a white editor, my first editor at the Riverfront Times in St. Louis, a guy named Tom Finkel. I was maybe 22 in my first job, local paper in St. Louis. And he sort of gave me this piece of advice where it's like, when you're telling a story, you want it to sound like you're just telling it to the person sitting next to you at the bar. So it's sort of an ideal that I've tried to aspire to in all of my writing. The beautiful thing about a book project is that you really have a lot more bounds of creativity, right? You have more space to work with. You have more voice that you can play with. Reading a lot of other sort of immigrant and second generation literature, whether it's Elaine Castillo or Junot Diaz, they did the thing. I think Junot Diaz was the first person I'd read who would not italicize the Spanish words. And I thought that was so cool and sort of because for the obvious reason of that, when I'm just talking, I sort of just implement Tagalog words in my speech like normal, just like we implement words like menu or cafe, which are French, patio, canyon, which are Spanish, into our daily language.
Kawawa was your
Kawawa, or like Peragaba, Perusog in Visayan, Tabiapo. These were just words and phrases that were just as much a part of my daily vernacular as anything else.
Yeah.
And so writing the book, I think I thought it was important for me to sort of have that voice. In part because I haven't read enough literature from the voice that you described, right? A homie from Vallejo, right? I wanted this to be a book that my high school friends and my cousins would want to read, not something that would feel inaccessible or overly dense. I wanted to feel like I was talking to them. I wanted it to sound like me. And I think with a book, every book, whether it's a memoir or not, is just intensely personal. You spent many years on it. You create this long narrative, right? It's a lot of pages, it's a lot of writing, and I wanted it to sound like it was me talking to people. So I'm glad that came across, because that was definitely a goal. And I think part of it too was just I wanted this to be like a document of the moment. I wanted this to capture what it's like to be a Filipino American today. And so I thought the kind of clearest way to do that language-wise was just to speak the way I, a Filipino American today, speak.
Yeah.
And I'm glad it came across, because you don't really know, right? When you kind of voice in your own head until other people read it.
Yeah, for sure.
I'd like to bring into the conversation, we have another panelist who's joining us by Zoom, Mila de Guzman. She's the author of Women Against Marcos. And I've known Mila for a long time. So she gracefully agreed to participate in this conversation. So I'd like to, can you just say testing, so we make sure we can hear you, Mila?
Testing.
Okay, good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. So we will, so great, Mila. Do you want to go ahead and start or your take on the book, how you like?
Yes, I'd love to. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Jaime Piaga and Carlos Bolosan Book Club for inviting me to this book launch of Albert Samaha's Concepcion. And I'm sorry I couldn't join in person, but thanks to the wonders of technology, I can virtually participate in this exciting event in this beautiful backyard of Jaime and Gary. So congratulations, Albert, on your groundbreaking book. I say groundbreaking because you have boldly set a new bar by giving your readers a sweeping account of our country's immigration story by using extensive historical research and a moving portrayal of your own family's search for a better life. So I just wanted to congratulate you again because of this. It was not easy. I'm sure it was not easy to weave these complicated tales into a coherent narrative. So there are just three quick points that I wanted to point out that resonated with me. I was a community activist in the struggle against the Marcos dictatorship and fighting for immigrant rights in the 1970s and 1980s. And in spite of the gap of decades between our ages, Albert, you really parts of your book really resonated with me. So I wanted to just quickly explain what they are. Well, first of all, in terms of the importance of history in understanding our immigrants' experience, when I arrived in this country decades ago, I was not armed with a thorough knowledge about Philippine history. And I really wish I had a copy of your book then, Albert. So it took my joining the Filipino American activist organization, which is Union of Democratic Filipinos, or Katipunan, KDP, to learn about Philippine and US histories, as well as about US-Philippine relations. So you have, Albert has unpacked his family's immigrant experience framed by these truths that are key to understanding our struggles as members of the diaspora in a country that Bolosan described and whom Albert quotes in his book, Why is America So Good and Yet So Cruel? And what struck me is that Concepcion comes at such a timely time because of the pervasive and dangerous disinformation in social media, which has given rise to very disturbing developments. As an example, in the Philippines, the Marcos loyalists are now propagating historical revisionism in order to gloss over the ills of martial law by calling that period the golden age in Philippine history. And then we don't have to look far enough. In the US, the teaching of history in some schools is now being questioned or challenged by demanding that certain books be withdrawn from the curricula, especially those about slavery or even about LGBTQ. The second point, quickly, is the push and pull factors of immigration. Too often there's an emphasis on the push factor when it comes to immigration, but Albert was able to extensively show in his book the magnetic pull of the US as a destination. So this country has long been the holy grail for Filipinos wanting to immigrate because of half-century of US colonial rule, first through force and later through education and cultivation of the Filipino population as consumer of American products. I mean, I've been here, many decades, but now and then I would slip and still call toothpaste as Colgate, which probably was the main brand that was being marketed during the American occupation. And presently, because of COVID and the shortage of nurses, I've heard of efforts now to recruit more nurses from the Philippines and other countries. So the pull factor remains pretty much as it had been in previous times when the US, in order to fill the labor need here, they recruited farm workers, teachers, medical workers, and other skilled labor. So, and the last point I'd like to make is how Albert was able to highlight the strong women in his family, like his Lola Caridad, the grand aunt Caridad, Lola Rizalina, Auntie Ging, and his mother Lucy. So I will not, I'm sure you will be able to read about these women. But when I was reading about Albert's Lola Rizalina, who was the one who was the impetus towards bringing her barangay to the US. I really like that term, barangay. I was thinking of Remedios Giaga, the mother of Jaime, Jocelyn, and the other siblings, who also sparked her family's journey from Baguio to LA, where she also built her own barangay decades ago. So not only do they help spark the efforts to better their families, Filipino women have also participated in the movements for change in the Philippines and here throughout history. And I work with a lot of inspiring women in the US dictatorship movement who often became the backbone of this activism. And their contributions still need to be memorialized. So again, thank you so much, Albert, for this book, which now joins the body of work that the young generation, the young Filipino Americans really need at this time, especially. So, can I switch a quick question to Albert?
Oh, of course, of course.
Okay, Albert. As someone who also did a lot of interviews for my book, I was curious about your process as to how you conducted these interviews and how you were able to get members of your family to really be so frank in telling you their stories about the Philippines and also coming here, all the difficulties and all the joys too of their immigration experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for those kind words. That really means a lot. Really means a lot to hear. I think, whenever I think about those interviews, and I think about Filipino, the culture that we sort of associate with. Obviously, I think one challenge to interviewing my family, as a lot of Filipino people know, right, this idea of kakahiya, right, is that this idea of shame, and how we don't like to talk about the tough times. We like to laugh about those tough times, and kind of brush aside the challenges that they create. But at the same time, we also love to chismis, we love to gossip, we love to talk. And I talk all the time, and my friends will always tell how I'll ramble for days and days and days. And so I think within that tension, I sort of had the benefit of also having family members that supported me and wanted to support the project. At the same time, I sort of also have my decade of experience as a journalist of knowing how to. I've spent my career interviewing people about some of the most traumatic moments of their life, and I sort of applied the tools I used as an investigative reporter with my family. And I actually found it a lot easier to speak with them about a lot of these challenges that I think I expected, in part because some of these stories and challenges I already heard about. They had mentioned it to me either in passing or just around a dinner table. And I actually think that the challenge became figuring out what to leave out and figuring out what parts of the story weren't relevant to the exact purpose of it. Because I think usually as a journalist, the main challenge is finding the puzzle pieces and then putting together whatever you can find. But in this case, I had way more puzzle pieces than I could ever fit into a book. And one of the things I learned in this process, the memoir writing process, is that oftentimes there are memories in my mind that are exceptionally vivid that I think about all the time and that I assumed would be meaningful parts of the book. But as I started to craft the narrative, I realized that oftentimes the memories we hold most vivid in our mind are not necessarily the ones that were most critical in our own lives. And sometimes the incidents and events that were turning points in our life and my family's life were moments that I barely even remember, moments that at the time didn't feel meaningful or relevant at all. It's only looking back, researching it, and putting together the story that I would see the relevance of those moments. So I actually found the interviewing process with my family to be the funnest, most enriching, fulfilling part of the whole process. It brought me closer to them. I was asking them questions I probably should have been asking them for years now. And it sort of gave them a chance to sort of tell stories that they hadn't really sunk their teeth into in the past. So it was actually it was a very pleasant experience because it was kind of just me and my uncles over beers, you know, or on the phone, talking about their memories, talking about their history, and it was good. I mean, a big part of it. I talked to a lot of other memoir writers who did not have similar experiences because they're asking their relatives questions that they don't want to delve into, and there were some of those, you know, parts of the book. You know, there's a you know, I don't really care too much about spoilers because it's a long book and there's a million things you can discover. But one of the sort of minor revelations, maybe not minor, one of the revelations in the book that I found in experiences I had always associated our exodus from the Philippines with the dictatorship, right? We were anti-Marcos, and as the dictatorship heated up, of course we left. But then when I was talking to my aunties about it, it turned out that 6 months before Marcos declared martial law, my grandmother found out that my grandfather had a secret family. And you know, how to disentangle the forces, right? It created a rift between them that was never full. And when she, is ordered? Show you the mic. Maybe.
5-minute break. Tell people while we deal.
That was actually the ghost of my grandfather, who did not want me to continue with that story at all.
It's right here.
Well, I'm turning it on.
Well,
I
we're having a break.
I don't know how long it's going to
You might
last.
want.
Thank you, everybody, for bearing with us. We're bearing with us. I think we're back live, and I forget where we were, but do you know where? Grandfather, okay. All right. Grandfather, take it away, Al. Take it away, Al.
I'm gonna get distracted by seconds. So 6 months before martial law is declared, my grandmother finds out like the weirdest of things where one of my aunties was going to the mall with her friends, and her friend was like, "Hey, isn't that your dad?" She's like, "Yeah, yeah." It's like, "Oh, is that your mom?" And she's like, "No, that's not my mom." It created this rift that was never healed. And you know, as it ultimately happened, my grandmother would kind of go to the U.S. by herself. And the way I always thought of it was because she was, you know, and it was true. She was laying the foundation while he was kind of holding down the fort in Quezon City. But then as I kind of learn this history, I find that it's not this sort of clean, linear cause and effect of the dictatorship driving us away. You know, how do you sort of disentangle the personal history of the personal factors that drove my grandmother to the U.S. versus the political factors that drove us to the U.S. And I think as a nonfiction writer, that's one of the biggest challenges, man, is that when you set out to write about the truth, sometimes you find that the truth creates inconvenient narratives that are not particularly clean and are not particularly simple to say. And so I kind of did the only thing I knew how to do was just lead into the truth and just explain the fact that, you know, when things happen, when these historical events happen, it's sort of hard to disentangle the impact of those events from the sort of actual social factors that are happening within households. And so that sort of was one thing that a couple of my aunties and uncles I didn't really want to talk about. But all it takes, as like any journalist here knows, is you just need like one or two sources to hold me down to talk about it. And my uncle Bobby and my mom and my Auntie Gang were very into like the chismis aspect about it more than the kakavia aspect about it. And they gave me all the juice. And that was eye-opening for me because I knew that the secret family had existed, but I did not know that everything happened in 1972 and everything happened so close together. And so everything that happened after 1972, how much can I lay at the feet of my, how much can I lay at the feet of my grandfather? I don't know.
So we're getting feedback from Zoom people. You're gonna use that mic instead, and we'll dispense with the PA. Testing.
Can I, Jaime?
Oh, go ahead, Mila.
Albert, just a quick follow-up question. Of course, your mother figures prominently in your book. So my question is, does she like the book?
That was my question. Yeah.
It's probably the question I had the most. Yeah, she did like the book. She does like the book. She read it. She was an early reader. I wanted to make sure I got everything right, so I had her kind of fact check the book. Her biggest issues with the book were the way I talked about Trump. I call him racist and sexist. And she was like, well, as a journalist, you need to be objective. You can't bias. I was like, well, I am objective and all that. So she had more issues with how I described her favorite candidate than with how I describe our family.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we're going to open the questions to our Zoom participants and also to our live audience here. I will alternate live and Zoom. So does anybody here have a question? Anybody here have a question? Please come up here and ask it. And then we'll have the Zoom participants next.
To raise your hand.
For Zoom participants, raise your hands, and our tech, CBGC tech, Vicky and James will key you in, okay?
Okay, this is Jocelyn Diago Rosenthal. And my question is that, and it relates to this, I guess, true narrative indeed, that the pull of the United States for Filipinos is rooted in the colonialization by the U.S., the global north. But then I was really surprised a few months ago when I saw this news item about a British young man who said from a young age on, his dream was to come to the United States. His idols were, the singers, the artists of the day. And so I was trying to reconcile that in my mind. I don't know, maybe you have the answer or not, but it's actually, it's a worldwide phenomenon that people do want to come to the United States. We have different circumstances as a nation, Filipinos, and yet it is a global phenomenon. So how do you see that?
Very true, very true. I think it speaks to the nature of empires, which rings across the ages. This idea, I think the term I use in the book is that the empire is a beast that grows hungrier the more it swallows. The expansion of American hegemony only leads to more people coming to the U.S. Right? It's sort of a self-perpetuating vicious cycle. For example, I think one of the sort of undercovered global stories today is the way, the lines of the colonial age remain in place today, right? If you look at the countries that are the richest in the world and have the best sort of healthcare statistics and economic statistics are the formerly colonized countries, and the countries on the other end of the spectrum are the formerly colonized countries. And those lines remain in place because the sort of disinvestment that was created in sort of the Philippines, right? 300 years of Spanish rule, they took out all the rice paddies and replaced with commodity cash crops. During American rule, they sort of industrialized the country and made it so that there were no shirt factories in the Philippines, but there were factories making the buttons for American shirts, right? Where the Philippines and so many other countries were developed in such a way where it was to serve the needs of the empire. And I think the sort of impulse for Filipinos to go to the States is very similar to the impulse of anyone, anywhere to go to the States, because we are the dominant empire of the age, right? It is our, dollars, English, our music, our culture is what people around the globe consume. And the thing that makes America or any empire more and more powerful is the fact that everyone will go there. And the more people go there, the more other people want to go there, because it just becomes kind of this dominant beast that grows. And so I think the way I sort of think of that divide and sort of the lasting damage of that is that we've sort of created this system where for people in the Philippines who see no other way to sort of fix their situation in the Philippines, they come to America. And then they come to America where they think they're going from being a colonized people to a colonist people, only to find out that those bonds, those hierarchies still exist here. Right? So we created a system where people who could potentially be middle class and of status and of the global elite in other countries come to America only to kind of start fresh and start from the bottom of the barrel. So it's created a system where the sort of plight of colonized people globally ends up being suppressed even further, because it is the people from the colonized world, from the global south, that come here and begin from the bottom, while their own countries suffer from losing this exodus of people. So I think that's where I think there is a distinction between a white European who wants to come to the US because they like our music and they like our culture and they like our sunshine, versus a person in the Philippines or Mexico or Nigeria or so many other places across the globe who feel compelled, who feel that there is no opportunity in their own country, and they don't feel so much that the choice, but that it is sort of the best, most viable path for them moving forward. And I think this is not unique to the United States. I think the United States perhaps is just the empire that has promoted this perhaps hypocritical notion of open arms, right? Like America's always been a country of immigrants. It is part of our ethos in a way it was not for the Roman Empire or the Aztec Empire, right? Being an immigrant is part of the American ethos, and that sort of casts a sheen, a veneer of deception over the reality that I think a lot of people, once they come here, realize.
Great answer. We'd like to recognize a Zoom participant. Has anybody raised their hands? No? Zoom participants, you're most welcome to join the discussion here. So raise your hands, or we will keep track of it. And as soon as we have some, I'll get a signal from Vicky if somebody wants to raise a question. So back to our live audience. Next question from our live audience. Please come up here. Introduce yourself, your name, and then your question.
Yes. Hi.
Lola.
Hi, thanks for being here. I'm Godfrey. I'm Gloria's brother.
Oh.
Thanks for being here. That's how we got connected. I think over time, I've learned a lot. I'm an immigrant from the Philippines. Over time, I had come to be familiar with stories of colonization, to put my immigration story in context, right? Like Spanish colonization, American colonization. One of the really interesting things that was new to me reading your book was recasting the revolutionaries of Filipino history. Like we learn about Jose Rizal, national hero, and that is a really interesting portion of your book where you begin to say, actually, he was in Paris when this happened, and then you talked about Aguinaldo, Bonifacio in ways that re-narrate how we perceive Filipino revolutionaries to be and who the real revolutionaries might have been to carry the movement forward. So I'm curious to learn more about things that surprised you as you were doing not just your family research, but like Filipino research as well.
Yeah. The Rizal history, the specifics of his art, was definitely one of those things. I think that's such a great detail to point out, because I, obviously, as a Filipino writer, I've always admired Jose Rizal, and I always wanted to be like him, right? He's a role model in many ways. And I realized that I was actually like him in more ways than I thought, and not necessarily good ones. Because as you pointed out, the sort of dichotomy between Rizal and Bonifacio was Rizal was the sort of elitist, European educated, multilingual Filipino who lived in Spain and didn't want independence for the Philippines, wanted the Philippines to have equal rights with the rest of Spain. And then you had Bonifacio, who grew up in Tondo, slum district in Manila, whose parents were working class. He wanted to just tear it all down and just start from scratch. And I think that is a dichotomy that exists today very presently for me personally in a lot of ways, right? When things look bad in America, or even when things look normal in America, and normal in America looks bad, it's this question of how complicit am I in the system, by sort of pushing for incremental reforms within the superstructure. Am I am I complicit in perpetuating that structure as opposed to tearing it all down like Bonifacio wanted to do? So that was high on the list of that. I think another thing that surprised me, I didn't know about Enrique De Malacca before that. Enrique De Malacca was an enslaved person who Magellan bought in Malacca, which was then Malaysia, which he had gone to colonize Portugal. And he enslaves Malacca, Enrique, brings Enrique from Malaysia west back to Spain, and then embarks on this journey across the Atlantic and across the Pacific with the famous journey that ends up in the Philippines. And in the Philippines, Lapu-Lapu famously kills Magellan, and the rest of the crew sort of, scatters to the wind. And the people in Magellan's crew are widely credited as being the first people to circumnavigate the globe. But Enrique de Malacca, his story was so fascinating to me. What happened was after Magellan died, so Magellan had promised in his will that upon his death, Malacca gets freed. But instead, the commanders who would replace Magellan refused to honor that. So legend has it, and this is part of this idea of how, because colonizers erase history, we can only sort of speculate based on the evidence we have. Legend has it that it was Enrique de Malacca who set up, to make a long story short, after Magellan is killed, the rest of the conquistadors return to the sort of area they had been in the Visayas, where they had been partnering with this king, Raja Humabon, who had converted to become King Carlos. And he invites the surviving members of the conquistadors for a banquet, and at this banquet he slaughters them and kills everyone except for like 3 people, one of which was Enrique de Malacca. So the theory is that Enrique snitched on them and said, hey, these people are going to try to take you out of power if you don't kill them. And so he kills them, thus freeing Enrique de Malacca. Now what's interesting here is when the rest of Magellan's crew goes back to Spain, while they're on the way back to Spain, no one knows what happens to Enrique. But reasonably, you can assume that maybe he goes back home. And if he goes back home to Malacca in Malaysia, the moment he reaches Malaysia, he becomes the first person to ever circumnavigate the globe, months before Magellan's crew makes it back to Spain. And we don't know for certain where he's from originally, but we know that he spoke the local languages in the Philippines. And some studies suggest that he was of Tagalog descent. And so a Filipino may have been the first person, or was the first person, if we don't know the truth, let's just own it, the first person to circumnavigate the globe, right? And so when we talk about what are the lasting consequences of erasing pre-colonial history, is those points of pride, right? Like I went through many years of school, maybe all of my years of school, without ever learning anything about the Philippines, other than the fact that we were involved in a war that a newspaper reporter in New York started, right? The Spanish American War. And that was it. And there's so little points of identity to hold on to, right? So in this book, I talk about how many immigrants are sort of, particularly Filipino immigrants, are chosen to choose between white culture and black culture, who you're associated with. I associate with black culture, a lot of other Filipinos with white culture. But the reason we had that sort of divide was because we did not have our own history to kind of hold on to. And I think the story of Enrique is probably, to me, the quintessential story of the pride that we lose when those stories get erased.
That's some of the history that I learned reading this book. Do we have it from our participant? There is? Okay. Why don't you spotlight them and they can ask their question directly. Thank you.
Hi, Albert.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So I'm Jem Doss. I teach at University of Maryland. And I just finished your book last night. I feel like I have to redo my syllabus because the name of my class is Filipino American History and Biography. So that describes your book. So yeah. So actually, the question I had is, in the last chapter, your mother talks a lot about morality, and since you mentioned your grandfather, I'm wondering how you think she reconciles that other family and morality and all of that kind of stuff.
That's a really good question, because my mom, for those who've read the book, she loves her father, she loves her grandfather, she defends him, to the ends of the earth. I think being Catholic helps, that sort of idea of reconciliation. I think the way I describe her defense of Trump is sort of similar to the degree that sort of imperfect conduits work on behalf of God's will sort of ideas. And I think my mom saw her father as a flawed man who sort of gave into temptation, just like Saul did, just like, Jesus did when he flipped over the tables with the tax collectors, that good people make mistakes and make bad decisions and all this and that. And so I think, so much of this too, right? The psychology of how we as a people, as human nature, is to sort of, we have our sort of ideas of how the world works. And it's really hard to shake those fundamental ideas. And so we find ways to sort of shape our understanding of things so that they justify our fundamental paradigms, because it's, few things are harder than having to recreate your paradigms. And so it wasn't even like a long discussion or a big reckoning with his own sins, because I think she just recognizes as, he made a mistake. Presumably he went to reconciliation and confessed his sins to a priest, and all is forgiven. And you kind of just keep it moving and moving on. And I also think, obviously the sort of family pride and sort of, Filipinos, like I think a lot of immigrant and colonized people cultures, we look after each other, right? We take care of our family. We always defend our people. And I think that ethos was very kind of strong in her sort of motivation to defend him, even despite those which she would have seen in a neutral setting as moral failings.
Thank you.
Okay, so from the audience, come on up. Come on up. The Zoom people want to see you.
Come to the stage.
So, Carol Ojeda Kimbrough.
Hello.
Introduce yourself.
Okay, introduce me, but I'll say my name again. It's Carol Ojeda Kimbrough. And it's not a question, it's more of as a woman. I hear a man ask a question, how did the family, meaning the women, accept this? And I see a man answering it. It really upsets me. And I'm sure anyone else who has a shred of feminism or knowledge of patriarchy would have said something too. And to the mic. Speak to the Michaela. So I really think that, thank you for answering the question. And I haven't read the book. I bought it today. I hope to get some more insight. But I would suggest that it has a lot to do with how women have been conditioned in the Philippines to accept our lot as women as lesser than men. In terms of family, I was just telling my husband that I found out that my parents will, all the things that they worked for in here is going to be given to the oldest son, who's the third born. I'm the oldest. And none of us are going to get it because he's a boy, he's a guy, he's a male, and none of the 4 women. So this is what Filipino family is. And why is that? It has everything to do with colonialism as well. You talk about American colonialism, I understand that, but I think we also need to understand some of the religious colonial baggages that we carry, that we got from Spain. Spain colonized the Philippines by using the cross and the sword. Those who didn't believe in God got killed. Americans used public education and the gun. So that's all I have to say. So it's not a question. I'm sorry. I just had to say it.
Good. Well
Thank you
said.
for saying that. Well said. Okay, yeah.
That's such a good point. And I'm glad you brought that point up, because there are many ways. Like the pre-colonial Philippines was in many villages a matriarchal culture, and for many islands, well, not to generalize across all the different villages and cultures across the Philippines,
Well,
but
the
for
way you
many
used to
people,
squeeze like
besides
that,
Mindanao,
tighten it,
the origin story
you know,
was of a
don't
man and
outside.
woman
You're
being
okay.
born from a coconut husk
You just
simultaneously,
lift it up.
right? And then Spain comes and they say, no, no, actually man came first and then woman was created from man. So this idea that
No,
that
not
this
it.
sort of patriarchy is colonial, I think is a really important one we don't really address enough because it's even older than the white supremacist colonization that we discussed. And there's this really interesting, I think, tension in the Philippines because so many families in the Philippines have very strong women and are organized socially in matriarchal ways, but administratively in terms of like where the money goes, who gets the land, is still structured in a patriarchal sense. I think that's a good point. I think the fact that these patriarchal norms were deeply, instilled in my mother's generation and in my grandmother certainly played a role in the fact that not only would my grandfather feel sort of immune to just sort of do this and not feel any consequences, but that his sort of children still loved him and that they sort of internalized this idea that men can sort of live as they please while women sort of have to clean up the mess.
Okay, we have do we have a question from the Zoom participant? No?
I have one.
Okay, come on, and I'm here. James, who is founder of CBBC.
Oh, okay. That's that's news. My name is James Castillo. I'm an independent filmmaker and also work with the community a lot since the Philippines, and also after coming here. I'm from Cebu, so all that story about the battles described in the book and you're telling earlier is, that's me. Reflecting on what was it like at that time and what is it like now, and then to comment on what Tita Carol mentioned is that, okay, so what was it like pre-colonial? And you mentioned as a Filipino American, because I consider myself as an immigrant, but being Cebuano in the Philippines, we don't deal necessarily only with the foreign Western powers, but also the internal colonialization that since I grew up, it's like if you're Cebuano, if you're from the province, you're lesser than the people from Manila, the capital. And so there's that thing that, okay, who are we and how do we reclaim our pride? The same thing when you make it a comment with that, maybe because there was a vacuum that you identify with either black or white. So what is your idea as far as how do we claim our own identity, not just as for Filipino Americans, but for Filipino immigrants and Filipinos, and for people in general that are seeking that wholeness in their identity?
I don't know if I have a concise answer to that because it's hard. It's in thinking about like what is Filipino identity, Filipino culture. It's sort of a mutt, right? Like we can't disentangle our current existence of Filipino culture from the colonial history, right? Filipino culture is inherently tied to Spanish culture and American culture and so many of the other Asian cultures around it. I think at the very least, the first step could be starting with kind of where is our shared history, kind of what are the experiences that bind us. I think the word identity gets thrown around a lot, so much to the degree that it sort of loses meaning, right? What is an identity? I like to think of it more in terms of like experience, right? What is the collective experience? So I think there are a lot of Filipinos in Mindanao that have a very different collective experience, right? They're still resisting. They would call the mestizo Filipinos in Manila colonizers themselves, right? And there's sort of this trickle effect of colonization there, right? And then they're still resisting that. And so I think it starts to figure out what is our shared collective identity and seeing where those boundaries lie. And I think it's sort of these concentric circles where my own, family experience is kind of just our own. And then there are ways it overlaps with yours and ways ours overlaps with other Filipinos. And the further out you go, then you find that our collective experiences also overlap with that of Mexican people and that of other people from South America and Latin America. And so I almost wonder if the idea of identity is not so much like a kind of a black and white thing, that is or isn't thing, but sort of part of a spectrum. That our identity is just sort of a bundle of whatever collective experiences we have and how it overlaps with that of other people. And I think that means understanding that Filipino identity is not sort of the standalone label with a checklist of items, but one that has items that overlap with Mexican identity, with Chinese identity in some ways, with a lot of other cultures that did have shared similar experiences, I think. And I'd actually be curious to hear your answer to this too, Anthony, because one of the points in your book, Latinos of Asia, is that one of the reasons, me personally, the reason it spoke to me is that I didn't associate, I sort of associated more with my Mexican classmates than I did with my Chinese classmates. But it didn't really make sense because on the census bubbles, I was filling out the same circle as my Chinese classmates. And so this idea that our identity and culture is not sort of defined by the labels that sort of the global north that the West has imposed on us, but actually is tied to kind of these deeper undercurrents that have sort of existed across the globe.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you know, this question of identity, it's not just checking a box on the form, right? I think what I realized when I was doing the research for my book is that identity is often that moment when you feel something with someone else and it's unspoken and it's not newsworthy. So that was the most newsworthy finding of when I did the research for my book, was that there were so many moments where Filipinos would be in Latino spaces and it wasn't noticeable. It would just sort of blend in with the crowd, even if they weren't identifying as like Latino, Hispanic, whatever. But that sensibility that their presence in these spaces was uneventful was how identity emerged. And if the question is like, how do you measure that? Because I think in other contexts, we're so used to thinking of identity in the more simplistic fashion of like, I'm this box or I'm that box. But as you say, there was this, with your own experiences, gravitational pull that sort of like had you erring on the side of hanging out with your Mexican classmates, that's something worth talking about. I'm gonna point to my partner Joe over there. Like, he's Filipino, but no one knows it because everyone assumes he's Mexican. So like people will know him for 2 years and assume he's one identity, even though he identifies as something else. And so who's to say that his experience in America isn't a Mexican American one if he's navigating the world and most people are seeing him in that way? It's funky.
Before we continue with questions, I'd like to introduce Joanna Belfer, who owns the Untitled Books, and hopefully you can get the book. Okay, Joanna, speak about yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here to support Albert's book and also to be here with Anthony because we're just so delighted to be able to start to highlight Filipino American authors at the bookstore. We have our own Filipino Pinoy Pride section in the store and have both of their books. And we're just so delighted to be able to do this because I think, you know, like both of you have talked about, as a young Filipino American first generation growing up here, we didn't see our stories in stores. We didn't see ourselves in movies or TV or you know, the radio. And so to be able to have a place where people, like I see little kids come in with their parents and they're like, hey, you know, like we have Nicole Fonseca's cookbook that says in big bold letters, I'm a Filipino. And I've literally heard little boys go, I'm a Filipino. Why is that book here? You know, so it's just really exciting for us to be here to support this. Please come and visit us in Long Beach. If you have any questions, I'll be here. I did also, that's the interesting thing to me in terms of like Filipino identity, because for myself, as you know, growing up and having to check those boxes, I never checked Asian until very, very recently. I always looked for the Pacific Islander box because I was like, I'm not Asian like a Chinese or a Japanese person, and I'm much more identified with like island people. And so it was only recently I was like, oh, wait, who checks which box? Because even in my own family, I have 3 siblings, and like half of us check Pacific Islander, and the other half Czech Asian. I'm like, that's weird.
Any other questions?
Can I ask? Oh, sorry.
Sure.
Oh, yeah. What's your hope for this book? Because when you write a book, it's out in the world, it's out of your hands, it's existing. What would you like to see? To use the, the whole traveling, like, what would you like to see your book travel? For like in the next year, in the next 5 years, next 10 years, what would be your dream? Oh, sorry.
Well, it's fitting that the Maryland professor made the point about a syllabus, because that kind of is my dream. I want it to be in the hands of young people. The person you described that you were, who would have read that book, right? Like, I guess my hope is that as many sort of Filipino people, I mean, I wrote for everybody, but I specifically wrote this for Filipinos, second generation immigrants, second generation Filipino Americans. I guess like the sort of grand philosophical ambition is that I hope it sort of helps people understand who we are. I hope that people who are Filipino who read this book understand, sort of don't see us as sort of just anonymous, ethnically ambiguous people that look somewhere between, Latino and East Asian. And I hope that people who are Filipino who read this have a deeper pride about our culture and understand our culture more. But I think the number one thing I hope this book does or inspires is and I can't remember who said it earlier today, but that everyone kind of writes their own books, and that everyone has their story. There's a line in this book that I'm particularly proud of, where I say something like, my family story is but one thread in a vast tapestry. And I think that's so true. I think everyone's family story is tied to these wider forces in vastly different ways than mine, even other Filipino peoples. And I think one of the difficulties of being a writer of an ethnicity that is not widely represented is that it casts this pressure on your shoulders to represent for everybody. And I've had the benefit of people like Anthony and Elaine Castillo, Marotile, Meredith Toulousan, Gina Postal, Sanel Barnes, on and on. These Filipino writers who have captured their experience, Jia Tolentino, all these folks have written. Grace Toulousan, I don't want to forget anyone if I'm mentioning all. All these Filipinos have written, Jessica Hagedorn, all these Filipinos have written so profoundly about what it's like to be a Filipino or Filipino American. It took a lot of pressure off of me, right? Where it's like, I don't have to write this to capture everyone's experience. I only have to write it to capture my experience. And I hope my book can do that for others. Or maybe there is like a 18-year-old aspiring writer, Filipino American in Vallejo today, who's like, oh, great, now I don't have to write about Vallejo. I can write about something else. I can write about what it's like, going to school, wherever you went to school, right? Where the more sort of representation there is amongst your sort of people, your tribe, your collective experience, the less pressure there is to speak to and for everybody. And the more ways we can sort of capture as many threads as possible, because I don't think my book could exist standalone. I think my book has to exist alongside a million other books on the same issues. Like, imagine if James Baldwin was the only Black American writer of the 20th century, right? That, as great a writer as James Baldwin is, that would still give us such a narrow view, right? And think about the debates that James Baldwin would have with Richard Wright, the debates that Booker T. Washington, would have with like the ideas of W. Du Bois, and like all the sort of groups. Like, there needs to be kind of debate and discourse within groups, because we are not among them. I'm sure there are Filipinos that have already read this book and disagree with fundamental paradigms within it, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing for that discourse to happen. I mean, I think a lot about like the movie Black Panther, right? Which is basically like a dialogue within the sort of Black and African diaspora about like the responsibilities of like being like a Black American versus an African diaspora, either on the continent or elsewhere. And that sort of my hope for what Filipino culture can become, right? Is that we can have our own dialogues within our communities, right? As my book shows, there are conservative Filipinos, right? That supported Trump, and my mom's far from the only one. And I think that's the fundamental hope, is that sort of is able to be a part of this collective, growing, expanding dialogue of what our sort of place in the world is.
Okay, we're getting come close to the end. Jocelyn wanted to make a comment.
Yeah. So I guess we invoke the spirit of the patriarchal grandfather. I'd like to also invoke the matriarchal spirit of my mother, whom Mila mentioned earlier. And, it's been kind of torturous for me to hear different experiences of Filipinas, like Carol mentioned, and her story about the dominance of the patriarchal system. But I'd just like to share a real funny story about my mom. She was the one that put up my dad to get a visa and take us all to the United States. So he came first, and then my siblings, including Jaime and my mom, followed on a ship, came here on a 21-day voyage on the last trip of this, one of the President liners, and that plied Pacific Ocean. This is the sunset or the dawn of the jet age. So our trip was the last voyage on this ship. But anyway, she'd always say, "Oh, when I get to the United States, they're gonna grab me. I'm gonna get a job and blah blah blah." So anyway, sure enough, she went and applied at downtown and got hired as a secretary or some office worker. She came back 1 week after and said, not necessarily "fuck this," but she said the boss asked her to make coffee. And so she said, "I'm out of here." First of all, she probably didn't know how to operate the coffee maker. But anyway, I have to say too that I really loved the book and resonated with how Anthony talked about the 3 different stories and the historical, the research and the focus on the background was truly, for me, beneficial, and I think will benefit a lot of our children and grandchildren going forward. Before I say my last speech, I want to also recognize an author here, Cecilia Manguera Brainard, who's an author of many books of local, Filipino Americans in LA. So I'd like to introduce you formally. We're gonna do a book launch of hers too, sometime this year. But I might as well say the closing. I don't know. Is that right?
Well, I'd like to invite Nila, if you have any closing remarks, one of our discussant commentators. I don't want to put you on.
Before any closing remarks, can I just ask Albert a couple of things?
Okay. Good.
Albert, I think one of your goals in this book was to try to find the answer to this question as to whether your family or even other Filipino immigrants, the decision to come here, was it all worth it? I want to find out whether you found your answer to that question. And also 2 things that baffling questions that I think you raised is, one, why do Filipinos vote against their interests? And for example, voting Trump, who is a racist, who's a misogynist, where is that coming from? And second is why would Filipinos who did not support Marcos now support Duterte, who is exactly trying to implement the same kinds of policies that Marcos did. So I think those are two questions that sort of you sort of posed a few times in your book. And I wonder if you got your answers to those questions and whether you would have a sequel to your book. That's the final question.
I'll answer the Marcos Duterte one first. You know, it's interesting because everyone in my family pretty much was anti-Marcos and is now pro-Duterte. And I think there's a lot of factors involved. I mean, I think central to it is this idea. I mean, I think a sort of surface level of it is that the simple version is that for a Filipino who's against Marcos pro-Duterte, they would say, well, Marcos was all about corruption. He stole money from the people, where Duterte's number one thing is anti-corruption. You know, that he will, whether it means killing everybody to prevent corruption, he will do it. And I think for a lot of people, I mean, one of the interesting, I mean, to speak to one of the things that surprised me, one of the things that surprised me was how disillusioned a lot of people who were part of the People Power Revolution became in the decades afterwards, where even after the Philippines has this historic transition of power, you know, this people where there was not a shot fired, just people filled the streets and it drove the dictator into exile, that even after that, there was not a reversal of fortune. There was not a change in the ruling class hierarchy. What happened was all the aristocrats that Marcos had been stealing from were able to take back what was theirs. And it never trickled down back to the people. There was no sort of upending of the colonial order that was in place. And so I think for folks that went through the Macapagal, the Estrada, Ramos administrations, not seeing sort of progress that they hoped for in the decades after Marcos, I think a lot of them did just say fuck it, and did say, if the sort of normal conventional means of politics aren't working, we need something else. And what Duterte offered was something else. And I think some of the most interesting conversations in the Philippines were with people that supported Duterte but did not like him, did not think that he was a good person, thought that he was misogynistic and brutal, but believed that he was still sort of the best leader for the country because the only alternatives were sort of a cycle of the same old aristocratic families. So let's try something new. Of course, those people weren't the people living in the neighborhood where the police are killing people, right? So it's easier for them to say. But when you don't trust your own government institutions, the more desperate you are, the more you're willing to sacrifice. And when you're in that position where nothing has worked, I think that sort of opens the door for someone like Duterte. And we see this across the globe, right? We see this in so many countries that were formerly colonized and that sort of have these liberation movements in the second half of the 20th century ultimately turned to authoritarians. In some cases with the support of the US and the West, in some cases because they just felt it was the best path forward for them. So I think that's sort of one explanation for it, among others. And I also think there's sort of this this idea that Duterte, and it's like I think sometimes the comparisons between Duterte and Trump are like overdone and sort of overwrought. Like I think Duterte is a much more savvy politician than he lets off. He tries to just look like, but he sort of, I think a lot of people sort of excuse a lot of his behavior in a similar way that you mentioned, right? This idea of patriarchy, where it's the bar for men is very low. And it's like, oh, well, he's making jokes about rape. Well, that's what my uncle does. You know what I mean? It's just doing the same thing. Yeah. And I think there's this sort of relatability where we excuse it because it's just like we hear around the dinner table, So I think that sort of allowed him, like this normalization of this misogynistic culture that makes it easier to look away, if not tolerate that. In terms of, can you remind me, what was the first question? What's that? Did I get my answer? Right. Was the sacrifice worth it? I don't know. And I think the conclusion I came to at the end is that I could never know if the sacrifice was worth it. I could never know if my life would be better had we stayed in the Philippines than not, right? But I think what I did find was that the answer I came to was that while I could never know if the sacrifice was worth it, I can know two things. one, I can know that if the sacrifice ever has a chance of being worth it, it has to be from this country living up to the ideals that pulled my mom and my uncles and aunties and my grandmother to the United States. There was a moment last summer, height of the pandemic, or 2 summers ago now, height of the pandemic, leading up to the election, where me and my friends had like very serious conversations about where would we go if the country descended into civil war? You know, would we go to the Philippines? Would we go to Toronto? Would we go to Mexico City? Go to Paris? And it's sort of, you know, the immigrant parents teach their children 2 sort of conflicting lessons or dialectic lessons that whenever things get bad, you can always cut bait, start fresh elsewhere, withstand the setback in hopes of making things better for the next generation. But then the other lesson they taught us is, well, America's still the best place to be. This was the place they specifically chose because they believed it would be the best place for all of us. And so, like, in our conversations about, well, where would we go if America collapsed? The next place is gonna have problems, you know? Canada's got some problems right now. France has had some problems. And what you get into is this treacherous hopscotch of like, where's the next place? Where's the next place? Where's the next place? And every place sort of is confronted with these sort of global post-colonial problems, neo-colonial problems that we deal with today.
Treacherous hopscotch. I wrote that down.
In the notes. Treacherous hopscotch.
Yeah.
And so like, okay, well, what can we do about that? Well, one thing we can do about that is just like make this the best possible place it could be. Because one of the conclusions I did come to from the book, well, and I think the conclusion I came to from the book is there's this great irony where, you know, if you believe the paradigm that so many immigrants, brown immigrants from formerly colonized nations come to this country because America messed up their countries, they've brought in an entire population of people deeply familiar with the idea of colonization who are coming in to fight the old order, right? Who better to push back? Who better to participate in this age-old battle for America's soul, which existed long before we came here, than people that are intimately familiar with the consequences of oppression and racism and colonialism. So in a way, America has sort of, through its own faults, brought in a growing group of people who are ideally equipped to push back against those faults. And like, if there was any place that should be made better, it's the empire, right? Because if this place becomes better, it makes a lot of other places easier to live in. It makes a lot of other places better as well. And so that's one. And I think the second conclusion I came to is that this is sort of like this is my country, you know, and as much, and one of the sort of ideas I want, or this idea of like while I won't know sort of whether the sacrifice is worth it, I can know like why the sacrifice was necessary. And I think that's the question, is that like, was there a path somewhere along the way we could have taken? Was there another decision our family could have gone to Montreal, could have gone to Rome or elsewhere? But this idea that the reason the sacrifice was necessary in the first place was because of the legacy of colonialism and because of the impact America had supporting Marcos, disinvesting in the Philippines, and contributing to a lot of the problems that drove them out. In terms of like whether there will be like a sequel, I don't think there will be a straight sequel, but I do think that like the characters in this book will continue to live on in my life, and whatever book I do write next will probably contain some first-person or memoir elements. And even if the core idea is not about immigration and colonialism, it will sort of contain the same sort of stories, or not stories, but the same sort of characters that exist here. And I do like to think of, I would like to think that the next book would at least advance some of the ideas here in different ways, and at least be in conversation with this book. And maybe down the line, maybe in the future, once enough time has passed, and there's, I'm sure, you know, I'll have very different perspectives on the conclusions I came to in this book. You know, ways that have changed, that could change my perspective on everything here. You know, I think the sort of premise I came into this book with is entirely different from the ideas that evolved in the last 5 years of working on the book. So I do hope to continue writing about my family. I do hope to continue finding ways to expose the forces of colonialism, some through my own story, some through the stories of other families. but yeah, I'm sure the characters will appear in essays or other books, different forms though. I don't think I want another book to sort of, I wouldn't want it to be derivative. Wouldn't want it just be part two. I would want it to kind of capture other subjects, other big subjects.
Great responses, Albert. Thank you so much, and congratulations again.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we have this is our first book launch activity of the Friends/CBDC. Next month in March, the third Saturday, we are hosting Filipinx readings of Gil Mangaung's memoirs and performances. The following month in April, we are going to be featuring Filipino American readings from Filipino American authors, which will be moderated by Cecile Brainerd. Again, thank you everybody for showing up. Please stay, mingle, meet and greet. We have some light refreshments. We will keep our camera open for our Zoom participants so you can kind of meet and greet with us remotely. But again, we'll see you at our next event. Okay.
I just want to mention that the Friends of, like what Albert said, and I'm taking the point of view that we have to stand our ground and, you know, do the best we can in our whatever corner of the United States we happen to be. But the Friends of the Echo Park Library have established the only Philippine heritage collection in the library in the whole 971 branch library system of LA City. So feel free to visit at 1410 West Temple Street. It's a very modest collection, but it's the only one in the city of LA. So it's by, I was going to link it to the idea of, you know, doing whatever you can. And this is an example of building institutions for our children and grandchildren and, you know, community going forward. That's very important, I think.
So there's one more. I'd like to call Irene Soriano, Suico Soriano, to just talk about our next month's activity because she's been at the heart, the center of organizing it.
Thank you, Albert. That's great. And this is really a beautiful space for this. And I don't know where we'll be next month. It might be at the library or it might be at Gil's community room, but please stay in touch with the book club so you'll know the location. But it's going to be a great event. We will have 2 Filipinx performers. It'll be a very queer-centered event. We will have Gil Mangaung read from his memoirs, Letter-Free, and he'll be celebrating his 75th birthday too. So please come.
Yes. Actually, this is our third backup in case the community. I've already blocked off that weekend. So anyway, just keep, check our website for right now. We're hoping that we'll be back at the community room of the Echo Park Library. With that, everybody, enjoy the rest of your afternoon.